Let's think about our second problem. This is called the is-ought problem. The is-ought problem. Let's start with this proposition here. Everything in nature is natural. You're like, I paid money to see this guy? Everything in nature is natural. What's the point? What are you getting at? Well, let's think about this. Premise one, every event in the universe is natural. Duh, yeah. Moral atrocities are events in the universe. Therefore, 3, moral atrocities are natural. If naturalism is true, this seems to follow. Every event in the universe is natural. Moral atrocities are events like any other. Therefore, moral atrocities are natural. How do we go from nature, what is the case, to what ought be the case? Let's think about the naturalist creation story. Of course, we would agree on this first premise here. The Big Bang started 13.6 billion years ago. But where we disagree is that the Big Bang, or no, I guess we would agree, the Big Bang isn't a moral cause. It's not a moral producer. It's not that bangs or explosions create some kind of moral ends. So we had a non-moral producer, a non-moral beginning. Consequently, after all of the Big Bang debris came back together and clustered into stars and planets and carbon atoms and so forth, then we had the non-moral process of neo-Darwinism. This isn't supernatural selection. This is natural selection, acting on random mutation, producing the extraordinary diversity of life. So the question is, how can you go from a non-moral producer, from a non-moral process, to a moral product, namely Homo sapiens? If there's a non-moral beginning and a non-moral middle, how do you get a moral end? Well, some people say, well, therein lies your answer, neo-Darwinism. Darwinism can actually account for objective moral values and duties. I would contest that. I would contest that severely. Let me tell you why. Here's Michael Shermer. He's the founder of the Skeptic Society. He's a PhD in the history of science. This is from his book, The Science of Good and Evil. Let's see what he says. He says, the moral sense of feeling good or feeling bad about behavior X, whatever X may be, is an evolved human universal. So he's saying, how do we know that morality is objective? Because the neo-Darwinian synthesis, working through cooperative primates and moving into clusters of people and having acts of reciprocity, and somehow it created and selected for lining up feeling good with doing good. You see what he's saying? And this is a human universal. By virtue of the fact that you're a human that was created by this process, therefore you have these impulses from evolution. He says, by a moral sense, I mean a moral feeling or emotion generated by actions. Why should we be moral, he says, is like asking, why should we be hungry or why should we be horny? What he's doing here is saying that we have these natural impulses, okay? I have an urge, an impulse, a throb to eat food or to be horny. And so what's he comparing it with? With morality, with altruism, being sacrificial, being loving. Why would I do that? Because there's an urge, a throb, an impulse that was given to us through natural selection. It was selected for to make us want to do what is good and sacrificial. Here's Franz de Waal. He's an atheistic primatologist. He says evolution selected for a, quote, benevolent, that is a good, impulse. A benevolent impulse. He asks this, doing good feels good. Why can't sacrificial love, altruism, be like any other natural human tendency in that it yields pleasure? I would like to contend that there's more problems with that sentence than there are words. Doing good feels good. Why can't altruism be like any other natural human tendency in that it yields pleasure? First of all, what this is admitting is that this is not objective. If you're saying that morality came from evolution, evolution by definition is change over time. Therefore, it cannot, by definition, be objective, because evolution implies change. So we're not talking about the same thing. We're using the same vocabulary. We're using different dictionaries. When we speak about morality, one is saying objective, another is saying subjective. This is arguing in a circle. It's saying, why can't doing good feel good? The question isn't, why does doing good feel good? The question is, what is the good? How do we account for the good? You're assuming what you're trying to prove. That's what you're doing. It begs the question. It doesn't account for moral praise. So one person has an impulse or a throb or an urge to do something good. And so what are we supposed to do? That is a good person. He served with Doctors Without Borders. She is a good person. She helps little kids after school with their homework. How could you morally praise an individual? It would be like praising somebody for having blonde hair and blue eyes, a physical property that they couldn't have had otherwise. This also confuses description with prescription. The neo-Darwinian synthesis, evolution, describes how life came to be and even certain social properties in the species Homo sapiens. It describes that, but it does not prescribe anything. You see where we're at? An is versus an ought. You can describe nature, but you can't prescribe the way that it ought to be. My final question for this view is, what if a sadistic impulse or urge or throb overpowers a sacrificial impulse or urge or throb? If these impulses were programmed into us through Darwinism, what happens if somebody has a more powerful sadistic impulse? Let me put that a different way. Mother Teresa had one set of impulses. Jeffrey Dahmer had another set. Which ones were right? If you're reducing morality to impulses, there is no way to adjudicate, to tell the difference between two different impulses. Impulses are just physiological products, and they don't have moral properties. Here's Sam Harris from The Moral Landscape. He says, perhaps there is no connection between being good and feeling good. That could be just as possible, given evolution. He says, in this case, rapists, liars, and thieves would experience the same depth of happiness as the saints. He's affirming that that's the case. Now, he doesn't believe that's the case. He says neurology tells us that usually doing something altruistic makes us feel good. Well, that would fit in a theistic universe as much as in a naturalistic universe, that God would want us to feel good about helping other people. Of course. But he's saying on a naturalistic universe, it could just be a coincidence that feeling good would line up with doing good. Michael Ruse and E.O. Wilson, one is an agnostic philosopher of science and the other is a Harvard biologist. They write this: ethics as we understand it is an illusion, fobbed off on us by our genes in order to get us to cooperate. They write earlier, human beings function better if they are deceived by their genes into thinking that there is a disinterested, objective morality binding upon them, which all should obey. Are you seeing some repetition here? Were you here last night? Free will, what is it? It's an illusion. Consciousness, what is it? It's an illusion. Daniel Dennett's book is called Consciousness Explained. And in the book, you know what he comes up with? It's an illusion. Terrible title, Daniel, terrible title. It's like me writing a book, Europe Explored, only to tell you there is no such continent and there's no people ever going there to explore it. Ruse and Wilson say, it is easy to conceive of an alien, intelligent species evolving rules its members consider highly moral, but which are repugnant to human beings. In the words of the late Stephen Jay Gould, the Harvard biologist, he said if we rewound the wheel of Darwinism, we could have a totally different set of species with a totally different set of moral standards and behaviors. That's what they're saying here. Michael Ruse has an article that's called, Is Rape Wrong on Andromeda, the nearest star system? Well, if evolution went a different route, perhaps in their species, some other alien race, perhaps it wouldn't be wrong over there. Morally repugnant to human beings. Like what? What could you conceive of? They say such as cannibalism, incest, the love of darkness and decay, parricide, the killing of parents, and the mutual eating of feces. I don't know why they put that on there. I don't know if that's immoral. It's just gross. You know what I'm saying? Like, don't do that. I don't know if you should not. Just don't do that. Have some self-respect. Anyways, if human beings, they write, had evolved from a stock other than savanna-dwelling, carnivorous man-apes, we might do the same, feeling inwardly certain that such behaviors are natural and correct. Isn't that interesting? Why is it that we feel that this is the good? Well, it could have gone any other different way. That is not objective. Richard Dawkins, who's more Darwinistic than Darwin himself, he says, as I support Darwinism as a scientist, now catch this, I am a passionate anti-Darwinian when it comes to politics and how we should conduct our human affairs. He says we alone are able to rebel against the selfish gene replicators. I'll leave it there. No, you cannot say, well, evolution accounted for it. When you're saying it accounted for morality, again, same vocabulary, different dictionary. That is not what we're referring to. Under a naturalistic worldview, the real world is identical to the ideal world. It is what it is, as people so commonly say. Nature is. We can't say that it shouldn't have been that way. Naturalism is the way that it is, unless we smuggle in moral assumptions. And in the literature on this, one of the things you'll pick up very quickly is they'll say science can prove morality, or evolution can prove morality, or this can prove morality. And guess what they do? Sam Harris does this in his book. He says how science can determine morality. And he starts his thesis by smuggling in moral assumptions. In other words, don't look behind the curtain. I'm just going to smuggle these in without anyone noticing. So to go from an ought to an is, do you know how they do it? They say something like this. If you want to be a social worker, you objectively ought to go to college for 4 years. So they say, yeah, if it is the case you want to be a social worker, you ought to go to college. Do you see the problem with that? You could just as easily switch out social worker for anything. If you want to become a bank robber, it objectively is the case that you ought to learn how to crack safes. There you go. I went from an ought to an is. Yeah, but I don't want bank robbers around. That's immoral. How do we know which one's moral and which one's immoral? That's the very question in front of us.